a display of 9 Royal Flying Corps and RAF First World War aircraft in formation. A unique collection which can't be seen anywhere else in the world. But thanks to one man's passion, history is being brought to life. These aircraft form part of the largest collection of World War I planes in existence, and has been built up by a man with an obsessive interest in the details of the past. But building and restoring historical aircraft is not why you've heard his name.
Because of my day job making films, I ended up with the resources of being able to afford to do this.
Peter Jackson is famous for directing, writing and producing the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies and blockbusters like King Kong. But more recently, his project to bring old footage to life in They Shall Not Grow Old revealed his passion for the First World War.
I come in here and see these planes, and I momentarily kind of forget that they belong to me, and I get excited. I say, oh my gosh, look at that, oh wow.
Peter Jackson has an unrivaled collection of aircraft, uniforms, weapons and other memorabilia. Some of his planes can't be found anywhere else in the world. Others he's recreated from scratch, using 100-year-old engineering techniques to rebuild them piece by piece using the original plans.
His collection is phenomenal. You name it, he's got it.
What he doesn't know about World War I and World War I aircraft isn't worth knowing.
When you strap yourself into one of these planes and take off, at that point, nothing else in the world really matters. It's like the world becomes a very simple thing.
Until now, all this has been kept behind closed doors, but we've been given an exclusive look at a collection that reveals one man's love affair with the Great War.
I don't know how big it is. You know, I keep my eye out, and if there's something interesting, I try to buy it.
Peter not only wants to collect the artefacts, he wants to know everything he possibly can.
Some people might say it's got out of control. I'd say it's evolved.
Set amongst the leafy suburbs of New Zealand's capital, Wellington, in a secret location, is Peter Jackson's creative world. A factory where his beloved aircraft are made. A warehouse containing his vast collection of First World War artefacts. And just outside Wellington, an airfield where they take to the skies.
What I value about the planes, the aircraft and collecting artefacts and things is I value the fact that that is a hobby, that is something that I can do that gets my head out of the film stuff. Because once you're in a movie, you're in it, 110%, and it's sort of like it can consume you, and sometimes at night time just escaping from that and looking at some stuff or reading some books or something is a good escape.
But to find the source of Peter's lifelong interest, we need to start on the other side of the world. His parents were both British. His father William served in the British Army, and his mother Joan worked in an aircraft factory during the Second World War.
My mum worked in the de Havilland factory, building the mosquitoes, and my dad was he was in the Royal Ordnance Corps on Malta during the siege of Malta for 2 years, and went into Italy after that.
But rather than telling his son about his own war experience, Peter's father preferred to regale him with tales of his father's adventures in many of the key battles of the First World War. Peter's grandfather William joined up in 1910, enlisting with the South Wales Borderers, which is now the Royal Welsh. William was serving in China when war broke out in 1914. He took part in joint operations with the Japanese against the German territory of Qingdao. In 1915, William was posted to Gallipoli, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. It was during this time he was mentioned in dispatches for conspicuous gallantry. An article in the Gazette describes how the 23-year-old led his soldiers forward to reoccupy an advanced post. For these actions, he was later awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. His grandfather fought alongside New Zealanders at Gallipoli and developed a respect for them. Stories of that time influenced Peter's dad to emigrate there years later. But it was the first day of the Somme in 1916 that had the biggest impact. According to his war records, William was injured by a German machine gunner and was brought home to recover in England, which is where he met Peter's grandmother. William never got to meet his grandson as he died in 1940. But the impact he had on Peter's life is felt by millions around the world today through his work.
I grew up surrounded by veterans of 2 world wars. So what I was, the things that I was exposed to and listened to in the conversations that happened in our house when Dad would have friends over and everything else, it was all geared towards the war really. And so I would just got an interest. And then Dad would also buy any First World War books that were coming on sale back then. And this is the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and it wasn't the flood of books that there are now on the First World War, and there's an onslaught of them now, which is great. But back then, there would be the occasional book would come out on some historian had written something about the First World War, and so Dad would always grab those and bring them home. So our bookshelf at home, which we didn't have a huge number of books, but there was a certain number of First World War books there that Dad had bought.
The young Peter Jackson enjoyed making model planes, and these models became the focus of his very first foray into film.
My parents got a Super 8 movie camera to make home movies with. I would have been about 8 years old maybe when it arrived in the house. I kind of liked the idea of making little sort of fictional films.
Peter enjoyed recreating mid-air dogfights, and his famous attention to detail meant setting some of his precious model planes on fire. And this passion was cemented when he got the chance to see full-sized planes on a family holiday.
When I was 12, my parents took me to the UK, sort of a family trip to meet all the cousins and uncles and aunts and things. So I went to the Hendon RAF Museum, and that was the first time I saw real First World War planes in the flesh. I was pretty obsessed by that stage.
40 years later, his incredible success as a filmmaker has allowed him to realise those childhood dreams. He has built up a vast hoard of war memorabilia.
The collection's really mostly First World War, a tiny bit of Second World War, and then there's a little bit of earlier, prior, 19th century conflicts. But so I have particular things I'm interested in. So if something comes up in an auction that I think would be a great thing to add to the collection, I try to buy it, but I don't really hunt things down all the time,
As you go down, you'll just notice there's kind of a little theme in every little bay, but it's kind of a little bit higgledy-piggledy, which kind of adds to the excitement of the place, because you keep finding things that you just weren't quite aware they were sitting there.
It's military historian Peter Connor's job to look after the entire collection.
Well, we just got things like, your good old mess tin, which your typical British soldier would have to have his meal in, cook his meal in. From the boring to the slightly less boring potentially, with the flamethrowers. They kind of designed that as an offensive weapon, so if you're trying to approach an enemy fortification or trench or something like that, it's a good way of inducing terror on one level, and a good way of killing people without having to directly hit them, because the petroleum product that comes out of it would spill across trenches and ground and round corners. And Peter also has a lot of New Zealand hats there, and then a lot of flying hats from the Royal Flying Corps, RAF, American flyers, as well as a lot of very early war gas masks.
Although the collection is private, artefacts are lent out to exhibitions.
All these things are kind of at various times considered for various displays that people want to put on. And Peter has also quite frequently helped out people who want to put on a display. He's very happy to loan things out. To be able to hold the actual item is much more of a satisfying experience than just kind of reading about them in a book.
Peter's remarkable collection was invaluable when he was making They Shall Not Grow Old,
We weren't afraid of anyone.
a documentary giving an incredible insight into the experience of fighting in the trenches, using original footage from the Imperial War Museum.
They said, we want to do something new with it and we're not sure what, and Peter sort of scratched his head, and he, on his next visit to London, he went in, he had a look at the footage, and he went away and had to think about it and came up with the idea. And initially it wasn't a colorised film that he was intending to make. That was something that came later. He started with getting some footage over, said send it over, let's see what we can do. If we put all the computer power that we've got and the amazing group of people we have down here in New Zealand, how amazing can we make this footage? And we were blown away.
Scenes were chosen from 100 hours of footage. They were then stabilised, retimed and restored before being colorised in painstaking detail.
One of the techniques we used for colour matching uniforms was to actually hold the uniform up against a white background on the screen and then just colour grade by eye. So in this case, John's got a uniform or a jacket. I would then go into that layer and just tweak the colours to balance them to look more similar or as close as possible to the jacket that is being held up.
Everything down from the unit badges that you see on everybody, we tried to be as accurate to recognising, you know, what regiment they were in, what time period exactly was, because things obviously like uniforms, etc., changed a little bit over times. So we tried to be as absolutely accurate as we could be. Even if we knew when an event took place, we would even try and find out what the weather was like that day, and sometimes we knew there had been a big storm or things like that. So the skies that we would make sure came through, because often on the footage you couldn't really tell what the sky was. It's usually just burned out in white on the old footage, but we would try to make sure that we were super accurate to that, because once again, you know, it's a historic record that you're trying to preserve, and it is really important that we got it right.
If you survive that, you'll survive anything.
For the soundtrack, Peter's team created a commentary using interviews with veterans from the 1960s and added brand new sound effects created especially for the film.
And in 5 or 6 seconds it took from count, you can pass through quite a number of psychological changes.
All of the footage was silent. And his brief to us was, it's got to be real. It's got to be like I was standing in that battlefield, and I want to make sure that I feel the explosions. And then debris and everything that falls off, we just build it out of component after component after component.
And the ground shook.
What guns were put into the movie had to be really accurate. So we had our sound design team who went and recorded and searched out the right type of field gun, of rifle, of pistol, of bomb that would have been dropped, a plane that would have been flying.
The stories he was told as a child about his grandfather's First World War service made They Shall Not Grow Old very personal for Peter.
I'm sure that whatever happened to my grandfather and whatever he experienced wouldn't be too dissimilar to what I was seeing and hearing as I was going through the footage. And I was acutely aware that this was probably this is must be how he felt, and these are the sort of sights that he was seeing.
Just a couple of miles from the film production house where Peter Jackson creates fantasy blockbusters like Lord of the Rings is a workshop where he can indulge his other passion, building and renovating First World War aircraft.
If you're looking to hire people or find people that have got experience building First World War planes, you're like 100 years too late, really. They don't exist, and so what you do is you look for sort of the people who have got really good woodworking skills, and we have those people on our film crew. So or they're engineers, they're metal workers who also came from films, because that's really what happened in the First World War.
Staff like Nick Larson, who's been at the factory for 13 years. Before that, he worked with Peter on Lord of the Rings and King Kong.
The big part about this business is that we really want to make First World War aeroplanes as authentic as possible. So we use the word reproduction rather than replica. So we actually are reproducing the aeroplanes exactly how they used to be from the First World War.
The 15th of August 1917 was when these plans were issued.
Many of the planes here are the only ones in existence. They've been painstakingly recreated from the original blueprints.
You don't want to run into the trap of saying, well, we know more about flying now than they did back then, you know, our materials are better, this and that. So you don't want to sort of take their designs and just, for no particular reason, try and improve them. You know, so we're just going to add some more steel here, or we're going to make this stronger, or this should be thicker. We never ever do that, because these planes were they were tested, they were put through extreme flight tests, they were put through combat, and they came out okay. So there's no reason to actually improve them.
His standard is 100% authenticity, so that sets the bar for us. There are a few occasions that we may need to step slightly away from that because of inavailability of materials. We may have to make minor substitutions, but we wouldn't do any of that really without consulting with Peter and making sure he's happy.
Often the engine is the component that drives the choice of which plane to restore next.
There's no point building a plane if you haven't got an engine for it. And they all had different engines. You know, there's lots of different types of engines, and so we see what sort of engines we have either in our collection or ones that we can obtain, or you know, and then we look at what planes those engines belong to, and we sort of just sort of figure it out from there.
We've got parts of Rolls-Royce Eagle, we've got Hispano Suizes, we've got Larones, and speaking of Larones, in this box behind me, so this is an original box with an original engine that never went into an aeroplane, probably was test run once and then put into this case here. So if you look inside here, you'll see it just totally covered up in grease, and that's just to preserve it. So on delivery to the factory, this is exactly how they would have received it in this box. So it's really unique. It's sort of like having a Star Wars figure from the 70s in a preserved box on a bigger scale. So have to navigate your way through a lot of engines here, a lot of very rare engines. Here's Roger. This is Roger Posthuma. He's our engine shop manager. What you working on, Rog?
Just putting together one of our new build Mercedes 180s. So this is an engine that we've reverse engineered from an original. So we've taken the original engine, we've pulled it all apart and then reverse engineered all of the parts and then remanufactured this one. We go to an extreme detail on these in that we don't change anything. We take the original part and we make our new parts exactly the same materials and exactly the same dimensions. We don't change a thing. And that, again, that's why any of these items in this engine would fit into an original engine if you had one. Yeah. So to create one of these engines could take between, depending on what type of engine, could take between 2 to 4 or 5 years because of the complexity of it. This engine itself alone here has something like 1,500 parts.
One of the oldest planes being rebuilt is a Morris Farman. The Farman brothers were huge names in aviation, designing more than 200 planes between 1908 and 1936. This plane predates the First World War and was a factory demo, which means only one was ever made.
The Morris Farman, the engine's in here also.
Yeah, sure, that's over here and that's undergoing a rebuild at the moment. And this engine was so this is an original Renault V12 engine. It's 130 horsepower. And it was in quite a bad state actually. So we've had to remanufacture quite a few parts for this one. We've had to make new conrods. We've had to make a new camshaft and all the gears in the front here. We just have to go through the whole engine, crack test every single part and then work from there and decide what we're going to replace and remanufacture.
As well as engines, there's an impressive collection of propellers.
The reason Peter has collected all these propellers is A, because he really likes them,
and B, we can use them to use their profile. We've got a machine that'll actually follow the contours of the actual existing wing and copy it straight onto our blank. So we end up with exactly the same prop.
Erwin worked with Peter on the set of King Kong. Now he's a specialist in making aircraft wings.
In this case, we're just fixing this one up. In other cases, we're fully building them, like these Moran ones. So we make all the components, we make every part, and then I assemble them up here on this bench normally.
And how do you find having Peter Jackson as a boss?
Well, I really like him, otherwise I wouldn't be here. Yeah, I want to make his dream come true as well. That's partly why I'm here. For myself, because he made my dreams come true.
Once the frame has been made, it needs to be covered. In another area of the factory, fabric is stretched over the plane structure.
G'day, Mike.
Hello, Nick.
How are you?
Very well.
What are you up to?
Just a bit of covering today. So when the bag is drawn onto the frame, we hand stitch it on, or in this case it's laced up. There are certain areas where they are hand stitched on. And then the whole entire bag is wet with demineralized water. The water actually shrinks the fabric because it's a natural fibre, so as soon as the water hits it, all the fibres tighten up, and then everything locks and it moves round and locks onto the airframe really well. And we let that dry, and then we go to the doping process where we'll brush dope onto the fabric, and then let that dry, and then we give repeated coats, and then eventually go for spray coats, multiple layers of spray coats.
And tell us a little bit about your background, so from the covering side of things and working with leather.
Sure, my background is in saddlery. I used to make saddles for a living.
Mike's father actually worked for the saddlery department for Buckingham Palace, so worked for the Queen. So his skill has all been handed down through generations. So it was your granddad that was in it first, was it?
Granddad, yeah, he started his business in 1911.
And from what I understand, you still have some of his original tools that you still use?
All my tools still.
Really?
Still Granddad's tools, yeah. Still have those. So all the stuff that would have been made off the day, World War I, I'm still using those same tools that Granddad used.
The level of detail in these recreations is astonishing, and it doesn't end with the main structure.
These are originals, and we use them for reference, and you can find out the spacing of drain holes. We can work on the size of the roundels, the colour of the roundels, any stitch detail. We can look at the size of the tapes used over the ribs. There's a multitude of information that can be gleaned from just a seemingly obviously neglected or unwanted artefact. German aircraft, there's no or very little actual plans, so we work a lot from photographs, crashed aircraft. The most just banal looking photograph can yield a huge amount of information. So in the way of the lacing detail like I'm working on now, patches where any parts of the aircraft come out from the fuselage, like in the tail skid area. We can work out where the patches have to go, work out all the signage. So there's a lot to be learnt from photographs.
Luckily for the team, Peter has built up a huge collection of images.
All around the walls you'll see photographs and advertisements from the First World War. What's super unique about these is that they are actually in a private collection. This is the only place that you'll see them on the planet. There are a few particular interesting ones that I'd love to show you. The Sopwith Aviation Factory at the end of the war in Kingston, it just shows you the scale of the production. So there's hundreds of aeroplanes being built, and they're all Sopwith snipes. There would only be a handful of Sopwith snipes left on the planet now, so there's a lot more in that photo than are currently around. This is really interesting. This is Anthony Fokker. So Anthony Fokker offers his services to the English originally, to the RAF. They turned him down. He's actually a Dutchman. And he said, well, I'll offer my services to the Germans. And they took him on and created Fokker, which is huge. There's a lot of Fokker aeroplanes in the First World War and then in the Second World War. Standing beside him is Werner Voss. So he was an ace, like the Red Baron. And then this is the Red Baron's crashed fuselage here on the ground, surrounded by British troops and the Australian there at the front, claiming victory. As you can see, it's all been cut up, so they took them as souvenirs. So often pilots, once they shot down an enemy, they'd go down and cut off the sort of the number or the insignias from the side of the fuselage. And what's really unique is that this particular fuselage from the Red Baron, Peter actually has the Iron Cross insignia from the fuselage, and that's safely away down in Omaka, down in Blenheim.
Peter Jackson's collection of World War I planes is the biggest in the world. This is partly because he restores and builds aircraft that no longer exist, from their original blueprints. But while his workshop in Wellington is not open to the public, there is a place where visitors can see some of his collection on show. In the north of the South Island, just half an hour's flight from Wellington, is the Omaka Aviation Heritage Centre. In the late 1990s, Peter Jackson became aware of a group of vintage plane enthusiasts and joined their number. Discussions began as to how to make the collection available to the public.
A group of us at the airfield here at Omaka realised we shared a common passion for heritage aviation, and amongst that was quite a strong interest in First World War aviation. So we tended to draw to us other people who had that interest, and one who came amongst us was Peter Jackson.
Peter had significantly more aircraft than the rest of us, and he had a look through the shell of the facility then and said, look, I know you had ideas of covering a range of eras, but I could fit the whole thing out with World War I, would you like me to? And we thought for about 2 seconds and said, yes, please.
For someone like Peter to offer to us not just his airplanes, but also his remarkable memorabilia collection and his own personal knowledge that goes with that, that was really powerful.
Peter brought in a group of experts that had worked with him on his film projects to help create tableaus, using lifelike mannequins to bring scenes from the First World War to life.
Peter appointed Joe Bleakley, who had been, I believe, an art director of his previously, and Joe came over and worked with us to design the way this would all be put together. And he was a very creative guy, great fun to work with. And some of the things he's put together are just brilliant. But he never liked anybody to be able to see everything at once, so he'd hide things. And when you go through the memorabilia, you've got to peek around corners, and there'll be some remarkable things like a Blue Max medal, but you can't see it unless you go looking for it.
Peter always had a fascination with aeroplanes and trees, and as you move through the display you see a few photographs on the walls of aircraft which have unfortunately ended up stuck in trees. So it was one of those inevitable things that happen in early aviation with low-powered aeroplanes and not very high from the ground and not many choices when the engine stops as to where you're going to go. So Peter was determined that he was going to build a set showing an aeroplane crashed in a tree. Jane in the meantime was very keen to have a snow scene, so what ultimately occurred was a combination of the two, and we've ended up with this delightful scene of basically a British pilot who's been shot down by a German pilot and he's crashed into the tree, managed to get himself down out of the tree, and the German pilot has landed alongside and is greeting him as a fellow aviator, not as an enemy but as a kindred spirit. And it's a wonderful emotional setting which again talks to those human stories, and it's one of our favourite scenes, and we love showing people through it and explaining what it's all about.
One of the tableaus created at Omaka tells the story of the death of the German flying ace known as the Red Baron. He was shot in an aerial battle over the Somme Valley in 1918 and died after making an emergency landing. Australian soldiers who controlled that area looted his plane for souvenirs. One can even be seen stealing his signature fur-lined boots.
If anybody knows of a person from the Great War, it would be the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. And we've got an amazing selection of his own memorabilia, things that he owned personally. There's a lock of hair. We don't actually know who it belongs to. Have to assume it was a girlfriend, but it sort of conjures up the real person behind him. The family used to have hunting trophies, and they'd mint little cups like this, little silver cups. And during the war, Richthofen sent to the family jeweller to have more cups made whenever he shot down an aircraft. Now, he had 80 victories, but the jeweller, we hear, ran out of silver at number 60, so never got that far. But we've got 2 of them on display. One is number 11, which was against Lano Hawker, the top Allied ace at that time, British ace, and the other is a number 10, which is a marker. Every 10th was a larger cup. And it's amazing to see those things on display, have them right here.
The Knights of the Sky exhibit opened to the public in 2006.
It's an amazing thing to be entrusted with such treasures. I mean, it's not like money or jewellery. This is unique, irreplaceable artefacts that are part of the history that we hold so dear.
Attention to detail is Peter Jackson's hallmark. If he's involved in a project, it will have been meticulously researched. And nowhere is this more apparent than back in the workshop in Wellington. As well as using original blueprints to build full-sized World War I planes, they have also been used by Wingnut Wings, a model aeroplane company based under the same roof, manufacturing perfect replica planes on a miniature scale.
I was a kid who was frustrated because when you bought model kit sets, there was only a few First World War planes, and there was a whole lot of First World War planes that there was no kit sets for, and that used to always frustrate me when I was a kid. I always wanted this plane or that plane, or I'd read a book and, and there was no kit set available. So I started a company to make model kits, and I'm able to make all the kits that I was frustrated I didn't have when I was a kid. All the kits are really the ones that I wanted badly that couldn't get my hands on.
The company's general manager, Richard Alexander, used to manage a hobby shop frequented by Peter Jackson. He brought vital model-making experience to a team that was strong on digital design, but less aware of how to turn those designs into kits that were enjoyable to build.
We set ourselves incredibly high standards as far as research and accuracy, and we owe that to history to get them as right as we possibly can, so that people that make these things in 10 years or 20 years or maybe even 100 years can get a good feel for what these aeroplanes were really like.
The company started small, with an early run of just 4 models in 2009, but they took the scale model market by storm, building up to 100 different kits. And from the artwork on the box to the instruction manuals and sheets of decals inside, the quality is unrivaled.
If you scale them up, they actually are good enough to go on a real aeroplane. That's how detailed they are. Down here, these are the instruments that are inside the plane, and if you zoom in on some of the transfers, you can read a word. Because we feel that at some stage in the future, these might be a surviving record of some sort, or we want people to come along in 20 years' time and they'll still build that model and it's still the best available.
We put a lot of effort into trying to make our planes, one, very detailed, very sort of, so you can just build it straight from the box and it looks like really kind of like a professional model, but also make it easy to build. So we've really figured out how we can help people, who might be a bit intimidated to make a First World War model kit set. From time to time, if I've got a weekend spare or there's a holiday or something, and I grab the latest one that we've done and stick it together. Yeah.
When he's not researching, producing or directing the latest blockbuster film, Peter Jackson returns to his other passion, World War I planes. His collection is remarkable, 100-year-old aircraft restored to their former glory or built from scratch using traditional methods and original blueprints. Some are the only examples to be found anywhere in the world. but they're more than just museum pieces.
I guess we probably have the most awesome flying club in the world.
At Hood Aerodrome, around 60 miles from Wellington, history comes to life as Peter Jackson's World War I aircraft collection of mainly British and German planes take part in displays and recreate aerial battles.
This collection here is all about the First World War. So in terms of the specialisation around that era, there are sites here that can't be seen anywhere else in the world.
We don't just fly around a gentle circuit, we actually demonstrate their capabilities and their abilities in mock battles. We try and be historically reasonably accurate, pitting aeroplanes against aeroplanes that they would have fought against.
The pilots here need to have extensive experience of flying small planes.
We invite our pilots, it's a collection so we can pick and choose pilots, and we've now assembled a very fine collection of experienced pilots. We have airline pilots, ex-fighter pilots, I'm one, agricultural pilots, and it's a great combination of skills. But they're all modern pilots, so we have had to take each of these pilots back to the beginning, literally the beginnings of aviation.
A lot of pilots are very keen to join us. What generally happens is they'll express an interest, and we'll have them along and just get them working with the aircraft on the ground for a period of time, really, and see how they integrate with the team that way. Once we're happy that they've got the prerequisites, we'll start them off with a basic level in our Tiger Moth, and then just gradually step them through the varying aircraft in levels of complexity. So some of our aircraft are more straightforward to fly than others. So we'll start with the simple aircraft, and I guess the ultimate challenge for our pilots is to fly some of the late war rotary engined aircraft such as the Camel and the Snipe.
One of the most challenging and unusual planes is the FE-2B, a Farman experimental plane with the propeller behind the pilot, a feature that hasn't stood the test of time.
It's one of the most exciting aeroplanes we have at the Vintage Avia collection. It's a little bit larger than all the rest. It's a little bit more interesting to fly than some of them, which is to say it's not necessarily the easiest aeroplane to fly, but come and have a look. It's designed with the engine and the propeller behind the pilots, which gives the pilot and the gunner a field of view in front so he can shoot at other aircraft. The unfortunate thing is it's very slow, so most of the other airplanes ended up behind, which didn't work out so well. So they very quickly decided that maybe it'd be better off as a bomber at night time, and it did very well right throughout the entire war. Anything ahead of the propeller, if it's loose, or could come adrift, more than likely it'll hit a propeller blade, and it's not strong enough to take a hit from anything larger than a small nut perhaps. So if that happens, normally the propeller would break, and then its life's very interesting for a short period of time.
One of the Bristol aircraft that can be seen at Hood Aerodrome was rescued from an undignified retirement.
The Bristol fighter first flew in 1916. This was built a wee bit later on, and then through the years it disappeared and was found again in the 80s. It was actually, we call it a barn find. Some people found the fuselage being used in the loft of a barn as a chicken coop, and it was rebuilt to an airworthy aircraft that we've got now. The aircraft, like all of the aircrafts of its era, and even until later in the years, are made of either fabric or, in this case, it's linen. It's actually shrunk with water, and that's what gives it a bit of a drum sound. It's a two-seater, and when it was initially introduced into World War I, it wasn't altogether a success because they flew it as they flew so many of their two-seaters, relying on the gunner in the back seat to protect the aircraft. The gun from the front actually comes through the nose of the aircraft, and that's timed so that the gun shoots through the propeller arc, and it's called an interrupter gear. I understand that the Germans were wary of engaging the Bristol fighter if there were any less than 3 or 4 of them against the Bristol.
It's a flying day. And today 9 pilots will be creating a unique aerial formation of century-old planes. At the pre-flight briefing, the schedule is decided based on last-minute checks on the day's flying conditions.
We'll kick straight off into it, starting with the weather, Hayley.
This morning we had a tempo from midnight last night to 7k viz and moderate showers of rain.
The aim is to show off the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Air Force in a combination formation as on the board, 9 aircraft.
Getting all 9 planes into the air requires careful planning. Each one needs to be hand-started by swinging the propeller, and some of them take a while to get going.
What's a good time? Aim for 8:30. I mean, we've got a lot of starting to do, and we don't have many starters. Obviously, we can get the 2-seaters and the SC5s going. They take a bit of warming up. Going for 8:30, but we'll do a time check as we get a bit closer. See how it might be optimistic now. Yes. Well, should we say let's say 8:45, and that gives us a bit more time.
Just a separating it out, and I'll still be the front and I'll break first, and then you two have got to.
So you'll be after us. Yeah, you'll be leaning after us.
Although each plane is worth hundreds of thousands of pounds and some as much as $1 million, they're not wrapped in cotton wool. Like this Royal Aircraft Factory BE2, they are fully functioning and airworthy.
We choose the days that we go out in these ones. We don't want it too rough, wind too strong, otherwise it becomes a bit of a handful. These ones were built in about 1914, 1915. They built about 3,500 of them. And they're probably one of the best all-round bomber, reconnaissance type airplanes. Mostly used for looking out over the trenches, look down, so they could spot for the artillery. Some of them had Morse code keys where they used to drop messages, and then they could range in and start putting the artillery on the Germans. Back during the war, they used to be up to around about 10,000 feet in these airplanes.
It's quite heavy, very sedate. It doesn't manoeuvre very quickly. It doesn't do anything very quickly at all, but it just seems to slowly accelerate down the runway and levitate off the ground, and before you know it, you're flying, and there you go. Nowhere else could you have the opportunity to fly aeroplanes like this, and to the extent that we fly them, yeah. It's very, very special. We feel very honoured to be allowed to do it.
These aircraft, they're all cool, really cool to fly, and they have their unique quirks to handle. But, I guess the best aircraft to fly is the one you're flying.
These are the real deal. So this is exactly what it was like to fly back in World War I.
These planes would never have flown together, so this aerial display is a unique sight. But they represent almost the full span of the First World War. The oldest, the FE-2B, first flew in 1915. From his years in the film industry, Peter Jackson has built up a diverse team of experts, many of whom now work with him on projects to build, restore and fly First World War planes.
I want to do things that add a positive contribution to the world in one form or another, whether people go to a movie I've made or they go to an air show and they watch some of these planes fly, and it's just something that actually people get a little bit of education, but it's actually a positive thing. There's nothing sort of negative about it.
Not many people get the chance to take their hobby to these lengths, but Peter hopes his work has helped keep a little of the Great War magic alive.
Hopefully whenever I fall off my perch, I'll have left behind, you know, a sort of a positive trail behind me.